Good morning, everyone. We are so happy to have you with us today. And it is my pleasure to welcome Roshi Joan Halifax and do a little introduction. I will share with you that Roshi Joan is a Buddhist teacher, founder and head teacher of the Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a social activist and author. She is a pioneer in the field of end-of-life care. She has lectured on the subject of dying and death at academic institutions and medical centers all around the world. She has received many awards and honors from institutions for her work as a social and environmental activist and in the end-of-life care field. She has continued to work with dying people and their families and to teach healthcare professionals and family caregivers the psychosocial, ethical, and spiritual aspects of care of the dying. Some of Roshi Joan's books include The Human Encounter with Death, Being with Dying, Cultivating Compassion and Wisdom in the Presence of Death, Standing at the Edge, Finding Freedom Where Fear and Courage Meet, and most recently, In a Moment, in a Breath. Roshi Joan encourages a holistic approach to end of life and training the mind so that we may transform both personal and social suffering into compassion and wisdom. Roshi Joan's personal practice includes creative expression through photography, brush painting, and haiku as explorations in beingness and joy. We are so pleased to welcome Roshi Joan today, and we look forward to this time of learning and inspiration. Thank you, Roshi Joan, for being with us.
Thank you, Tara and Carl. And I have to smile, the introduction. Yeah, it's the first time I've been introduced. Oops, let me make sure I've been introduced with some acknowledgement of the haiku and photography and calligraphy that I do. It's an important part of my life, and I'm saying it right now to all of you because caregiving is a calling, and also it requires so much of us. And having the chance to have some creative expression available to yourself, like my good friend Ginny Lacoste, who's a palliative care physician at the University of Texas Medical School, took up ceramics and works with clay every day as a way to bring a kind of pause into her life and to let another part of her brain, if you will, express itself in metabolizing the challenges that she bears witness to and attends to every single day. So it's an honor to be here, and I'm going to ask you, just so that I have some sense of who is here, if you wouldn't mind opening the chat, and if people would put what their relationship is to the end-of-life care field, whether you're a doctor, nurse, social worker, psychologist, hospice volunteer, or a caregiver taking care of a family member. And I have to find the chat. Yes, I'm opening it up. Put it in the chat because I'd love to know. Okay, wonderful. All right, I'm going to go to the top. Hospice volunteers, social workers, expressive arts practitioner. Wonderful, Faye. Many volunteers and social workers. That's just great. Hospice nurse. What is a navigator, actually? I don't know what a navigator is. Tara, or Carl, could you tell me what a navigator is?
Absolutely, Roshi Joan. Navigators typically help people find their way through the system if they're going
Okay, wonderful. Rapid response nurse. Wow. Pediatric palliative care nurse coordinator. Oh, wow. This is so wonderful that you're here. Many nurses and family support, palliative care nurse, hospice ED, and so on. Wow, thank you so much That is really what my young students say to me. That's awesome. Thank you. So, as I said, whatever role you have in this field of end-of-life care, of palliative care, of caring for those who are very ill, it is, for some of you, it's your job, but for all of you, it really is a calling. And a lot of times I share this story. I read it in Ira Byock's, one of his books, and I was a student of Margaret Mead a long time ago, and she had a very interesting way of seeing things, really unique. And she also was really cared about human beings. So the story is something like this, that years ago, she was asked by a student, and as many of you know, Margaret was an anthropologist, what Margaret considered to be the first sign of civilization, first sort of appearance of, what it was to be so-called civilized in a culture. And, I think the student was expecting her to talk about fish hooks or about clay pots or grinding stones. But Margaret apparently said something very surprising. She said the first sign of civilization was a broken femur. If your leg is broken, and you're in the animal kingdom, most likely you die. You can't flee from danger. You can't get to the watering hole or to the river to get a drink. You can't hunt food. More or less, Margaret apparently said, no one can actually survive if they're a creature, an animal, a broken leg, long enough for the bone to heal. A broken femur, she noted, is proof that someone has taken the time to stay with the person who fell, to bind up the wound, to carry that person to safety, and to tend them through recovery. And then apparently, Margaret said, helping someone through difficulty is where civilization starts. Now, it was in Ira's book. I don't know if the story is true or not, but I know that the view is really true. Helping someone through difficulty is where civilization starts. And I believe that's why you are doing what you do in this end-of-life care field. So about a year ago, I was in Dharamsala, India, and I was moderating a science meeting on behalf of the Dalai Lama and the Mind and Life Institute. And His Holiness returned again and again to a very important theme for him, a kind of life theme. And that is his view that we are one human community. Now, I think in relation to what is happening in Gaza, in Israel, Ukraine, and the 30 other wars around the world, that view is really critical. And His Holiness would go on and he would say, it's so important that we are warm-hearted and that we are engaged in some way of benefiting others. And The second meeting I went to in Dharamsala that a year ago was with with young leaders from all over the world: Lebanon, Afghanistan, Ghana, the Americas, and so forth. And he was responding in this meeting in part to the sharing of these really remarkable young people, that they experienced so much despair, futility, and hopelessness in the work they were doing as social activists, as leaders in their community. And he said, you know, what is most important is cultivating an altruistic heart. He said, this is an antidote to futility. It's an antidote to hopelessness. And at other times in the meeting, actually in both meetings, he would say, in addition to cultivating, you know, an altruistic heart, it's actually engaging in actions that were of benefit to others. And, you know, I thought about his years in exile, and also Thich Nhat Hanh's years in exile, and also Desmond Tutu, his years in the prison on Robben Island. I thought about Malala and her work. Individuals we know about, but so many that we encounter whose lives are deeply transformed and opened and resourced by their service to others. And this is, in a certain way, what we're addressing today. You know, how we can actualize compassion in a very particular way in our service to others. And also how we stay resourced. This is really important. So I began this work in the end-of-life care field at the University of Miami School of Medicine in 1970, when I returned from doing field work in Africa. And at this time, I was a young medical anthropologist. I worked all over the hospital system. And one of the things that was really clear to me is that not only do patients suffer, but also those who were giving care suffered. And I turned toward this work in a gentle but slow way, but very committed way, because of my grandmother, who had suffered from cancer and suffered a stroke. And she was put into a so-called care home, and there she experienced such deep misery and also a real lack of care. And we would, this was in Savannah, Georgia, and our family lived in Florida, and we would go and visit my grandmother often, and she would be begging my father to help her die. And that was over 60 years ago. But I still had that feeling in my body of what I experienced as I bore witness to her agony and also to our helplessness. We didn't have at that time the resources to bring her home. And the care that she received couldn't really be described as care. It was minimal. And in fact, it was dehumanizing. And finally, her death came. And when I walked up in the small church where her funeral service was being held, I walked up to her coffin. I made a commitment to try to change or be a part of the change in the culture of medicine, the culture of care, at least in the West, to some extent, in order to address the care of those who were fragile. And also, as this work opened up for me in caring for dying people, that landscape began to include those who give care as well. So I have come to see this work that you do, this work that I have done in the past, truly as sacred work. And what makes it sacred is this experience of compassion, whether we're feeling compassion for a nation, a people, a landscape, a group of friends, a family member, or a patient. And you know, after so many decades in this field, I haven't lost heart. I'm really grateful to share some perspectives with you that might serve you in this very complicated medical landscape that we find ourselves in. You know, excuse me, I'm going to mute while I clear my throat. It's quite early here in Santa Fe, so forgive. Okay, thank you. So some years ago, I was appointed as a distinguished visiting scholar at the Library of Congress in DC. And during my tenure there, I developed a heuristic map of compassion because of what I had suggested to you in just a few minutes ago. That what I saw in the work that I was doing, coming alongside dying people and working and in teaching clinicians, that there was an issue around what has been called compassion deficit. The effect on clinicians, the effect on patients, the effect of compassion deficit on family members, and also the effect of compassion deficit on the systems in which people served, whether it was a family system or a hospital system. And I began to really deepen this research in relation to looking at the work being done in neuroscience and social psychology in research on compassion. And one of the things that was clear to me is that we did not have a very clear notion of what compassion is. It's kind of a sort of fuzzy feeling, you know, sometimes mostly associated with religion. And what I came to understand, again, mostly from the work being done at the University of Wisconsin, at the Keck Laboratory, and also at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, is that, unusually enough, compassion is a kind of triple win. And those who receive it benefit deeply. Those who experience it, who are compassionate, have markers indicating flourishing, well-being, that it's you actually, when you're actualizing true compassion, you are, it's uplifting. It also is an immune enhancer. It's also a de-stressor and so forth. There are a lot of biomarkers associated with compassion. And those who witness compassion are uplifted and often want to actualize compassion themselves. Well, that's very interesting, because so often, and I deeply respect Figley's work on compassion fatigue, but I think what we've done, and this is, according to, again, the work being done at Max Planck on compassion, is that we've conflated empathy and compassion. And maybe I'll have time to go into that a bit more as the morning unfolds. That in fact, compassion from the point of view, again, of work in social psychology and in neuroscience, does not have a downside. So last year, I was reading the New York Times, and a wonderful palliative care physician, Sunita Puri, said, she wrote, the prelude to compassion is the willingness to see. The prelude to compassion is the willingness to see. It's that capacity to actually be grounded enough to perceive suffering, but also to have the insight to understand, though we're in resonance with suffering, that suffering isn't necessarily our own. And I also recalled in this work the words of my friend Terry Tempest Williams in relation to this. She wrote somewhere, she said, a friend of mine asked me, or said to me, you're married to sorrow. And I know, just to interject, people used to kind of get on my case, because there I was working with dying people, working on death row here at Upaya, supporting work and feeding the homeless, working in the Himalayas in remote villages, bringing healthcare into areas where there was no healthcare accessible, and so forth. And I remember I would be sitting, like at a dinner, nobody wanted to sit next to me because I was, the person who was doing all this charnel ground work. Maybe they were afraid I'd bring it up. Well, this is what Terry said. I looked at him and said, I'm not married to sorrow. I just choose not to look away. There is deep beauty in not averting our gaze. What it means not to be a bystander, but to actually bear witness to the truth of suffering. It's about presence, and this is what you bring to your work. It's about bearing witness. And then she wrote, used to think that bearing witness was a passive act. And she said, I don't believe that anymore. I think, she writes, that when we are present, when we bear witness, when we do not avert our gaze, something is revealed. The very marrow of life. We change. A transformation occurs. Our consciousness shifts. Her words for me, and I share this with you, to me really reflect the ethos of care and courage that is truly at the heart of what it means to care for people who are suffering deeply. And yet, for many who do this work, and even at times for me, there has been or can be another experience. So I want to touch into that reality briefly now and share some thoughts on how to work that edge in a way that might serve. First is to recognize that if we are doing this work, it is a calling. And we are asked not to turn away from those challenges that we are bearing witness to, but also to the challenges that we experience internally in relation to our encounter with suffering. So I want to just touch briefly into some resources that have come to me through my wonderful colleague, Dr. Cinda Rushton, where we've been interacting over these issues for many decades. She's been at Johns Hopkins as a palliative care, pediatric palliative care nurse for over 30 years, and also holds the Bunting Chair in Ethics. And she is really, deep in the system, where she's called all over the hospital to bear witness to and to help clinicians and family members work through what seem like intractable issues in relation to decisions that have to be made in care of dying people. And I also want to say that this, what I'm going to share with you, which is a fairly new work for me, is comes out of the work of the late Stephen Southwick, who did really important research on resilience. And of course, all I've learned from dying people, from caregivers and chaplains over the years. So first, the notion of resilience is very interesting in the sense that how do we encounter great challenges and not be crushed by them, but to be able to learn from them? And there are at least 7 really important keys that I think that are important for us to consider. They're capacities that we're called on to develop, and they're all based in compassion. And the first of these capacities is, our ability and our view that allows us to actually reframe difficult situations in a way that is generative. And one of the things that I personally do a lot of when encountering, really the difficulties and the kind of work that I do is, I ask myself, what am I learning here? Instead of moving to a narrative of victim or despair, futility, what am I learning here? How can I reframe this situation in a way that is fundamentally generative? A second capacity is our adaptability, our nimbleness, our flexibility in the face of uncertainty. And of course, as a longtime Buddhist practitioner, I have a view that is very helpful, and that is the truth of impermanence. And I'm recalling an AIDS patient that I worked with many years ago, who was suffering from intractable pain. And he showed up in an interview with me, and he just said, I got it. Nothing is permanent. So often when we find ourselves in the grip of a complicated situation that is characterized by intense suffering, the feeling is this is forever. But no, impermanence will prevail. Another aspect is that is really critical, and it has to do with relationality. And that's our ability to actually share positive emotions. A lot of times in our teams, we're just looking at the problems, but we're not looking at the positive moments that have happened in the journey of our situation. And we're kind of in the grip of negativity. And so being able to actually share positive emotions, including appreciation of others, is something that is profoundly nourishing in a family system or in a team situation. The fourth piece has to do with moral character. And that is developing and sustaining a really strong ethical perspective and a dedicated ethos of care, a kind of culture of care, and reinforcing that within our system. The fifth one is, supporting the sense of purpose, meaning, and efficacy of how we serve others. And we know that that is one of the things that is important in relation to engagement as distinct from burnout. When we feel that our work is meaningless or inefficacious, it really breeds burnout. The sixth piece that I want to mention has to do with, again, relationship, and that's growing a strong team, whether it's a professional team or an interprofessional team or a professional and family team, where there's a sense of respect, of safety, of reliability, of connection and community. And my student, Dr. Wendy Lau, has written a wonderful book called The Inner Practice of Medicine. She's an emergency room doctor. And she said, one of the biggest issues among clinicians is the absence of a sense of community. So developing a community is a strong indicator of the presence of resilience. And in this regard, the practice of good self-stewardship, meaning our capacity to see our own capacities and our limitations with compassion, and to engage in actions that are fundamentally life-affirming. And then, of course, the last piece is the value of compassion, to really understand the value of compassion. And these different aspects, in a way, create a culture of care within ourselves and within our systems, our teams, or our families, that deeply affect morale. They deeply affect our ability to show up and to sustain and deepen this work. So I wrote this book, Standing at the Edge, Finding Freedom Where Fear and Courage Meet. And it was a book that was primarily exploring originally, when I first started it, compassion. But as I began to unpack this kind of map of compassion and also the grace process, which I'll talk briefly about at the end, what I realized is that caregivers of every stripe, with the best of intentions, experience incredible challenges around virtuous aspects of what makes the work possible. But actually, these virtuous aspects have shadow sides. And I articulated, a lot of content around what I have called these edge states, which are 5 internal and interpersonal qualities without which we really can't serve adequately. And yet, if these resources deteriorate, they can manifest in our lives as landscapes of harm. So these are bivalent qualities or bivalent states. They include many different bivalent states. I've just isolated 5 because these are the 5 that were mostly, in my view, from interviewing now thousands of caregivers all over the world. And they include altruism, empathy, integrity, respect, and engagement. So, for example, altruism can easily turn or be manifested as what has been called in social psychology pathological altruism. And that is selfless actions that are in service to others. We know that these actions are essential to the well-being of society and to the natural world. And honestly, you and I wouldn't be alive save for the altruism of our mother and probably our father. However, sometimes seemingly altruistic acts end up harming us egregiously. They can also harm those whom we're endeavoring to serve. They can harm the institutions in which we're serving in. Or they can harm the nation that we're serving in, like what happened in Haiti in the United Nations, where a lot of difficult things happened as the UN went into Haiti after the huge earthquake in the name of service, and much harm arose. And this issue around altruism and pathological altruism, it's really an important landscape for we as caregivers to explore. As I said, altruism is really important in society and for us as individuals. And without it, none of us would be here. But when it goes into its shadow aspect, we can experience complete collapse. The second edge state that I've written about is empathy, and the transformation, the toxic transformation of empathy is called in the world of social psychology empathic distress. And this is the experience of when we expand our subjectivity to another, which is really important for many of us in relation to, being with suffering, being in resonance, connection, sensing into the suffering of others. But that experience of over-identification can actually overwhelm us. And it's also important to understand that empathy expands our understanding of others and can fundamentally deepen our sense of concern. I often say a world without empathy is a world where we are dead to another, to each other. And yet, on the continuum of empathy, so to speak, there's empathic distress, which comes from over-identification with the suffering of others. And at the other end, our defense is objectification, where we're completely cut off from the experience of empathy. So whether it's over-identification or objectification, empathic distress, which is on that whole continuum, is something that we have to be very aware of. And one of the ways that the social psychologists, I'm talking about the work of Daniel Batson particularly, and of Nancy Eisenberg, where we have the perspective of, as we're witnessing extreme suffering, we're in resonance with it. But we also have the wisdom and the insight to understand that we are not that person at a very fundamental level. And also to know that if we collapse from over-identification, we will withdraw our connection, break our connection with the person whom we're endeavoring to serve. So we say that in the literature, but certainly I know this from my own experience, that empathy has 3 different valences, and sometimes all are active at the same time. And one is known as somatic empathy. It's where, another person, for example, is experiencing physical pain, and we can sense that within our own body. There's affect or emotional empathy. You're bearing witness to someone who's suffering from, extreme grief, and all of your grief gets activated, and you over-identify with that individual, and the weight of grief bears down on you as a caregiver. And there's also cognitive empathy. And cognitive empathy relates to the experience of having the view of others. And, I use this example in Standing at the Edge. During the Second World War, perfectly intelligent, fine people began to identify with the view of Hitler. And as a result of that, they lost their moral bearings. And this is happening in my country with the identification with leaders who have a not very good sense of moral character, very developed moral character. And people identify at a preconscious level with such individuals and lose their moral bearings. So that's cognitive empathy. So as I said, empathy is really important usually it is part of the experience of compassion, and too often it's conflated with compassion. But just because we are experiencing empathy, whether it's physical or emotional or cognitive, doesn't mean, as in the case of compassion, for example, that we will have this spontaneous and uncontrived impulse to actually relieve the suffering of another. In fact, being in the experience of empathic distress can disable us and cause us to withdraw and to become very self-focused. So there's a lot to be said around the importance of empathy, but also the shadow of empathy. The next piece I want to address in the Edge States is known as moral suffering. Well, actually, that's the shadow, but the Edge state is, it's integrity. And this is, having strong moral principles and having moral character. But for example, when we witness acts that violate our sense of integrity or of justice or of beneficence, moral suffering can be the outcome. And this is when the harm we experience in relation to the transgression of our tenets of basic human goodness. And I've isolated 4 different aspects of moral suffering that I think are important for us to be aware of, and how essential it is to really have, as I said earlier in relation to resilience, a strong ethic of care. And the first is moral distress. And it's that pain or anguish that arises in the mind or in our body or in our relationships when we're aware that there's a moral problem and we feel that we have a responsibility to address that problem, and that we actually have determined a remedy, a path through, but because of external constraints or internal constraints, we end up engaging in perceived moral wrongdoing. And, during the COVID pandemic, this was an immense issue, particularly for patients who were intubated in the ICU, where family members were not allowed any access, where clinicians were standing in for family members, and keeping family members out, and perceiving what they were doing as morally transgressive, in spite of the fact that they were bearing witness to coming alongside a dying person, but keeping the family away, because this was the hospital policy that was in place in relation to protecting family members and so forth. Issues in Canada around medically assisted dying. When is it the right thing to do or not? Who engages in the process of assisting someone who has made a choice to have their death hastened and such? Our prison system here in America, where executions are carried out, where medical teams and others in these prison systems find themselves experiencing moral distress in relation to executing people. And then there's moral injury, which we know from the military, but also is rampant as well in the medical situation, where there's a deep psychological wound from actually witnessing or participating in a morally transgressive act. And it involves the feeling of dread, of guilt, and of shame. And kind of in contrast, that's moral outrage, where the shame and blame is being expressed outward. It's an expression of self-righteousness and indignation toward others who have violated social norms. And then the fourth one is moral apathy. And this is when we don't care, or we don't care to know, or when we're in denial about situations that cause harm. And even privilege is in this category. And addiction is in this category. And of course, this leads to moral disengagement. So in relation to this, Cinda's written quite a bit about this in her book on moral resilience. And one of the things that she is so clear about is that, we all have moral residue in it, which is the accumulation of unprocessed moral suffering. But what our work as practitioners, as people practicing good self-stewardship, as people living, relating to communities of care, knowing that almost always, whatever remedy that we might be able to apply in any given situation, usually it's not perfect. There's residue, there's leftover. Sometimes there's a lot of residue. And how you work that edge in relation to moral residue is really critical. Or you can suffer from moral injury, or flip into moral outrage or moral disengagement if moral residue is not addressed. And of course, one of the gifts of moral residue is humility, knowing ultimately that things don't always turn out so perfectly. So the last two pieces are in the edge states world. Are respect and engagement. And respect, we know, has to do with how we hold beings and things in a way that is characterized by regard. But it can also disappear down, into a swamp of disrespect. when we go against the grain of our values and principles of civility, and we begin to disparage or bully others or even ourselves. And I write about there are two basic valences, which is horizontal hostility, that's disparagement and bullying among peers, or vertical violence, that is bullying or disparagement, disrespect, that's top down or even bottom up. And Cinda and I often talk about what's happening in medicine right now, in medical settings where patients are attacking clinicians and caregivers. But this can happen in a family system as well. Yeah, vertical violence from the bottom up as well as top down. Then the last edge state is engagement. And this is about, our work giving us a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning in our lives, our work serving others, working in a healthy workplace. But when we overwork and we're not practicing good self-stewardship, and we are caught in the grip of pathological altruism, or we're in a poisonous workplace, or there's this feeling of the lack of efficacy, that whatever we do doesn't seem to matter at all. This can lead to burnout, and which cause, as we know, really great physical and psychological harm. So the thing about edge states is that they teach us, and they actually can strengthen us as we learn from going over the edge, and we make our way back, both because of our love of what we do, but also, supportive community. And we actually can heal from, burnout. It's not like it can go on forever, or moral distress and so on. So in looking at this work of the shadow content, I realized that the medium for the transformation of the toxic aspects of edge states was, in fact, compassion. And compassion, as I said, has this, and Dalai Lama says it, and Richie David says it, and I think it really is the case, is a powerful and transformative process that allows us to attend deeply to the experience of others, to genuinely feel concern for others, to sense into what will serve others, and potentially to be of service. And I often say that that compassion is also non-transactional. In other words, our experience of compassion, which is spontaneous, and it's unprescribed, it's completely non-rule based, it's completely context dependent. In other words, you can't say this is how you do compassion per se. But you can train in aspects of the landscape of compassion that actually prime the spontaneous emergence of compassion when interacting with those who are suffering. And this is what I want to just touch into here at the end of this talk, and that is grace. So after I did this heuristic map of compassion, I realized, that it was really helpful for me, and actually for many others, in understanding this complex landscape of compassion, discovering that compassion is composed of non-compassion elements, that it's context dependent, that it's unprescribed, that it's an emergent process. It's actually not a feeling. And but I recognize that if you're working in a complicated clinical situation, or in a prison, or in a school system, or you're a parent with kids who are really crossed up, that there would be something of immense use in developing a tool that would help to prime compassion, the emergence of compassion as we're interacting with others. And this tool is something that we offer a training in here at Upaya, and also Teachable has a whole sort of course that we've developed in this particular training. There's a national grace organization in Japan with hundreds of palliative care people in it, and grace study groups all over Japan. It's a technique that's used in many medical settings in various parts of the world, including my own country. And grace is a mnemonic that stands for the G of grace. It's a process. You're in the encounter with someone who's really suffering, and it's important to get grounded. So one gathers one's attention. So that's the G of grace. It's allowing yourself to bring your attention, presence, what Sunita Puri was speaking about. Compassion is that ability to see deeply, to not turn away, to be grounded, to bring your attention not only to the person or situation where suffering is really present, but to your own subjective experience. The G of grace. The R of grace is recalling your intention. This is one of the things that I learned from so many clinicians, that they had really lost the thread of why they had entered into this field. And this is coming back, if you will, to the aspirational aspect, why we're doing this work of caring for dying people. It's really a calling. And it might be just a flash that we touch into this kind of sense of, I remember why I'm here, just to be of service to others to the best of my ability. But recalling our intention is, sort of the direction that we want to go into. There's another process, and it's also to access our actual motivation. Because sometimes our motivation is fraught, is complicated. That we're doing this work to please others or to not attract censure. We're doing it because it kind of boosts our ego and so forth. So servicing our motivation is part of the work that is really important. Not only locating our intention, but being aware, which is, this is often at a preconscious level of what our motivations are in doing this work. So the R of grace is recalling our intention and recalling our motivation. And the A of grace is attunement. And this is counterintuitive because most of us have been taught right away to bring our attention to the other. But actually, this first pulse of attunement has to do with being aware of what's happening in our own body, what's happening or up for us emotionally, and also how we see things. And again, it can be just a flash, but it also, so much information about our perception of an external, so-called external situation is already taking shape at the preconscious level in our own very subtle somatic responses to what we're perceiving. So self-attunement is really important, and it is, coming back to grounding and bringing our attention into the body and into our heart and into the mind. And then allowing our subjectivity to include the experience of another or of others. Not to withhold, but to open ourselves and to practice this kind of radical inclusivity, knowing that over-identification will lead to empathic distress. So stay grounded. And the sea of grace is considering what will serve. And so we could, our grounding, our intention, and our attunement allows us to really, it gives us the capacity to have the insight to look more deeply or to respond more deeply than what is necessarily prescribed, what is expected of us. So really seeing or considering what will really serve. And the E of grace is engaging and also ending. Engaging in a way that is congruent with what will serve this individual, not only with, what's going to serve us. This is work of service. And in this regard, I always remember the words of Rachel Naomi Remen. She says, the wonderful doctor has been teaching this course at Commonweal for many years. And she says, helping, fixing, and serving represent three different ways of seeing life. When we help, we see life as weak, or the person we're interacting with is weak. When we fix, we see life as broken. And when we serve, we see life as whole. So engaging is really coming from this foundation of service. And then in regard to this interaction, I just have to say my colleague Tony Back, who's a palliative care physician, Tony, and Cindy and I have taught together for many years and collaborated on many projects. And Tony said, Roshi, ending. I went, absolutely, you're completely right. How do we end that interaction? Either intrapsychically or interpersonally, with a sense of gratitude, or maybe we have to ask forgiveness or appreciation. Ending that interaction, completing that interaction, so we can move on to the next encounter. So each of these elements that I've talked about, grounding of attention, intention, attunement, insight and considering what will really serve, engaging and ending, are trainable. And this is the thing that was so powerful for me in doing this work, to realize, no, I can't train in anyone in compassion in general, but we can train in the suite of aspects of compassion that, when activated, compassion emerges. And you say, well, that's a lot of stuff to go through. And I just say, actually, what the training does, or what knowing about these different elements does for us, is it happens in an instant. It's kind of like riding a bicycle. At first, you have to, the handlebars and feet, you're thinking of all the different things, so you're not going to fall down or bump into something. But actually what the training does, and what practice does, and why practice is so important. And I say practice in the sense of, as an old-time meditator, how important it is for me to have a daily practice that allows me to drop in deeply and to remember why I am here and how I can bring my best to others. So what practice does is instantiate or nourish or water the seeds of these cognitive and affective and somatic capacities within us. that allow us to respond to a world with care and with balance. So as I finish this talk, I want to thank everybody, and I'm very happy to open to questions right now, but also I invite us to take a breath. And I sort of would love for you to turn your cameras on. I sort of miss seeing you. It's nice to see Tara. Hi there. nice to see you, Carl. But I'd love to see, I want to put my view on gallery, even if everything gets slow. I want to see you. Hi. Great. Oh, that means a lot to me. Thank you. Just you're the size of a postage stamp, but that's better than just your photograph or a blank screen. So anyway, Carl, I'm happy to take any questions for the remaining time.
Wonderful. That sounds really good. Thank you again. So just for questions here, does everyone know where there's like a little virtual hand? Do we have it here on Zoom that you should be able to raise? Do you see it there, Ruth or Tara? No? Oh, okay. Maybe then we'll just have to write it in the chat. Like if you want to talk, just
hand is there, Carl.
It's there. It's there.
Reactions. If you click on the reactions.
In reactions. Ah, okay. Wonderful. So if you want to raise that virtual hand, or just write in the chat if you want to unmute and ask a question, and then I'll just call on you. And just again, as a reminder, I mentioned it before, but it's being recorded, this session. So if you unmute and ask a question, it will be part of the recording on our YouTube page at the Champlain Hospice Palliative Care Program. So any brave takers for a question here?
Don't be afraid.
I see there's one person raising
Elizabeth.
their hand.
Hi, Elizabeth.
So you can unmute there.
Actually, it's Elspeth, but I was christened Elizabeth, but I was always called Elspeth.
Elspeth, hi.
I also have some practices around haiku and other kinds of poetry and photography and songwriting. And when I hear you talk about the E being partly engagement and also about ending, I have found that sometimes in this work, I will write a poem for one of my people where I'm connecting with someone in a deep way. I'm also an assessor for medical assisted dying, which I do see as part of palliative care, but many people don't. And so that's also a kind of an edge that I struggle with. But I wonder about, that whole thing of having a practice for ending, how we say goodbye. I also think of in the hospice, we always light the 3 candles for the people we care for. But if you'd like, I wonder if you'd say more about that sort of ending piece.
So, Elspeth, are you speaking specifically about just prior to the moment of death, or you speak, which ending? Because there's lots of endings.
Yes. Well, for myself, I'm not a MAID practitioner, so I don't actually do the end of life procedure. But I do say goodbye to my people when I know that they're leaving. Sometimes I don't get to say goodbye because they die suddenly and unexpectedly. So I'm left with saying, wow, I need to kind of process my own, finish my business around this particular relationship that I had. Some of them are really traumatic deaths. So the ending every time you have an interaction, there's an ending with the person.
Exactly. This was the point that Tony made to me. And I was so appreciated his insight. And, one of the things that, again, this is in relating to my own experience, but also in interacting with Tony and Sinden, people in this field, taking the time. We're not talking about 20 minutes, but taking the time to physically connect and to express deep appreciation. And, I remember Tony, we were kind of role modeling this, and he was, saying how this is, he works in oncology, how important the physical touch is when appropriate. One doesn't always physically touch, but when appropriate, and the real connection. But now, if I'm working, for example, with a person from Diné, a Navajo person, it might not be appropriate for me to physically touch that person. But there's almost no occasion when appreciation doesn't serve. Gratitude is one of the most important ways that we engender healing at a really deep level. Thank you so much. And thank you, Elspeth, for the work that you do.
Wonderful.
Diane.
All right, Diane, yeah.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I've been taking all sorts of notes, and in grace, I don't have anything for the C. Could you refresh my memory, please?
Yes, it's consider what will really serve.
Thank you.
And the thing about the Sea of Grace, of course, we have been given, if we work in this field, a lot of good ideas about stuff we can do. But also, can we allow ourselves to drop beneath the prescriptive, to be really open to surprise?
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I got so much out of this.
Thank you, Diane. So grateful you were here. Nancy, hi.
Hi, thanks for your talk, your reflections, for sharing. One thing I wanted you to just maybe touch on a little bit more. You mentioned it at the very beginning, and I'm a volunteer who is currently trying to launch a program in legacy writing with Diego Hospice clients. And it's also something that I'm reflecting on and hoping to talk to the organizers and the coordinators at Hospice Care Ottawa about having some kind of writing sessions for volunteers and for workers. So my question is, at the very beginning, you talked about caregiving and this line of work as being a deep calling that requires a lot of us. And you mentioned that it's important to have some form of creative outlet. And I'm wondering if you could sort of share some of your experience in that regard, or share any reflections you have about that.
Well, I think legacy writing is really important for people who love to write, so to speak. But I also feel there are so many avenues to express what's happening at the preconscious level that is related to writing, to the arts, and so forth. And, just naming a few that Tara mentioned at the beginning, poetry. We have here in our community a wonderful man who is a lawyer and has been through so much in his life. And just, came here very vulnerable. And he uses songwriting, which is wonderful. When Stan and I were working with dying cancer patients in the 70s, we would have our patients, if they wished to, make mandalas. In other words, we'd give them crayons and colored pencils and oil pastels, or whatever, and have pieces of paper, and to have them draw out their experience. Haiku is a wonderful medium because it's like, a drop of gold. It's not the whole gold bar, but it's, and to poetry, whether it's being composed or whether it's being shared, you as a caregiver can sit with a patient, as I have many times, and not offer a tragic or morbid poem. Some of my favorites, it's like tickling into the moment. There's a kind of, so you have this kind of E.E. Cummings connection, if you know what I'm saying. Another one is to hand your patient a little camera and have them record, take photographs of what's important to them as, people are moving in and out of their hospital room and so forth. Providing a nonlinear means for people at the end of life who are, still wakeful and have got a kind of creative juice where they want to express what's happening, but they don't have necessarily the regular words, or are reticent to share in, a conceptual way or diagnostic or therapeutic way. It's really important. And this got stirred up for me, I have to say, in the work that Stan and I did, in the early 70s, in the drawing of these people who were dying of cancer. It was so really revelatory. And no matter how crude the drawings were, again, what I said earlier is the sense of appreciation that someone is stepping out of this obsessive, completely justified self-concern about, managing their own somatic affective journey as they move into the final phase of their life. But allowing people a creative outlet and expression that is shareable is very important. Thank you for the work that you do, by the way. Anything else you would like to say, Nancy?
No, thank you for your reflections on that. I think the other thing is that I just know that myself, whenever I'm in a situation where I have called to do caregiving, whether it's to a son recently with some severe mental health issues, that if I don't have my own outlets to ground myself, then, so I mean, we're looking now at ways to help, our clients who may be living with terminal illness find some means of expression, even though they themselves don't see themselves as creative people. It's to kind of catch them a bit by surprise and offer them opportunities to try their hand at something that will actually give them some joy. But I think that's an important lesson for all of us as well, who are caregivers, to fill our own well and put our own mask on first.
I just want to say yes to what you're saying. One of the most transformative experiences that I had during COVID, where I was bearing witness to the grief and the moral suffering of caregivers all over the world who were just bewildered, is I began to paint. And it was so, it brought me into a completely different state of flow. And it was just this huge resource for me. So, bringing that into the team or the family system and into your individual life, I think is really wonderful. Thanks, Nancy, so much. Let's just take a breath. So I'm reminded, as I asked you to do that, during the pandemic, I created this wonderful series of 55 practices, short meditations, these micro meditations called In a Moment, in a Breath. And it was exactly for, what we're doing right now, where, each of these 55 cards has a different micro practice in it. A lot of times we think we have to do some, really long thing, but I tell you, one breath can bring us home. Okay, Nicole.
Hello. Thank you. I really found the talk this morning. You've verbalized many of the things I've actually been feeling the last couple of years. I'm an ICU nurse for most of the last 2 decades. So I've seen and done a lot these last few years. They've been very challenging for all of us. But what I found most interesting about your talk was the edge states of what I've actually found difficult over the last couple of years is I lost my mother during COVID, not of COVID, but so, I had my own personal loss. And so being in ICU over the last year or two, I've started to become almost over-identify sometimes with my patients and their families. And so that was distressing for me. And I thought, I needed to leave this environment. I've been here for a very long time and I needed to leave this environment. The funny thing is I did leave that environment and I went to a Monday to Friday nursing type job. And although I loved learning the skills, what I found was that the environment was so toxic, the interpersonal relationships between the different team members, that it actually started to affect my own mental health. And I had to leave. And so I went back to ICU. And the funny thing that I find is that, it was like coming back home. That is my home. Since the beginning of my career, I was a healthcare aide and then a nurse. So I've dealt with death and dying my entire career. And I've always felt it a privilege to be there. When a person is coming to that end of their life, unfortunately, sometimes in ICU, it is a very quick traumatic thing for them or their families. And other times it's not. We make it as peaceful as possible in the hospital. But what I want to say is that I'm really encouraged and intrigued by the talk and your book. So now it's, I'm going to look on Amazon for it because I think it's so important. So I became aware of what I needed to, I want to stay in my environment, but I know that I have some work to do in order to keep myself safe in that environment. I think your talk sort of helps and leads to that. But I just wanted to say and ask, that do you have, just very briefly, any tips, on ways a person can help prevent that over-identification when you have families? And I mean, so many of us deal with death and dying on a daily basis. It's our normal. Just a couple tips that you may want to share. But thank you so much for your talk today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, there's a number of things, and I don't want to be prescriptive, but this practice of good self-stewardship. I love that you stepped out, you recognized you were in an unhealthy environment, and that you actually didn't have the will or the resources to continue in being in a situation which was toxic. And you saw it and you did something about it. And so much of our work has to do with knowing our own situation adequately so we can be aware of when distress is happening, whether it's physical distress, moral or social distress, and to actually either, if we have the skillful means to, transform the system, wonderful. If we don't, conscientious objection. If we don't, step away. And seeing one's own limits with compassion is really important. So this whole area of self-stewardship, which we're not working on today, but is something we concentrate on in the clinician trainings we do at UPI, is really critical. And the other thing, part of the self-stewardship paradigm, or actually part of this work is, as I've kind of lined out some stuff today. A lot of times we have this kind of intuitive sense of something is off here, but we don't have a name for it. Being able to name things is really important, but also having collateral relationships, which might be therapeutic or team or family or friends or group, where we can actually make our own concerns transparent to others. So community and communication is really critical here. We cannot operate as Lone Rangers, but you cannot also have a community that is basically putting you down as you share your vulnerability. There has to be a community where there's safety, trust, and respect, and warmth. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is what Nancy, I think, anyway, I'm kind of getting lost in the names, but it's like having a creative outlet, being able to state shift out of the sort of grip of the incredibly demanding work, and to allow another part of your own psyche to express itself in a way that is not accessible in the sort of context of our work. And the last thing is have a practice. I have to tell you, what has made all the difference in my 81 years of service and of work, of teaching, is having a daily practice. And it is essential. So my friends, we are at the magic hour. I have to step away. Thank you so much for all that you do. And I look forward to crossing paths with some of you in the future. And Tara and Carl, deep thanks for making this opportunity possible for me today.
Thank you, Roshi Joan. We know we kept until your final minutes, so I will make our thank you and our goodbye brief, but we appreciate so much all of your wisdom and your time and all of these messages that will help us continue to bring awareness and reflect on our well-being and enable us to continue to do this work. So we wish you well for the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks again.